Just when the palace thought it had braced for everything, Princess Anne dropped a revelation so powerful it shattered the fragile calm. With King Charles's health declining, everyone expected a carefully worded update, a statement drafted by advisors and polished by royal aides. But what they received was something entirely different, something raw, unfiltered, and devastating. In front of family members, courtiers, and those who had gathered in hushed anticipation, Anne's steady voice cut through the silence like a blade. Her words carried not just sorrow, but a shocking truth that had locked away Charles's final wish. The weight of those words landed hardest on Prince William, whose entire composure crumbled before the eyes of those present. He buried his face in his hands, overwhelmed by grief and the crushing burden of revelation. The monarchy, already fragile under the shadow of the king's illness, was suddenly thrust to the edge of chaos. The atmosphere in the palace that day was one of unbearable tension. Everyone had known that time was slipping away, that Charles's condition left little room for illusions of strength, yet no one expected Anne to seize the moment, to step into the silence with the conviction of someone carrying more than her own grief. It wasn't her place, many thought. She wasn't the heir, she wasn't the queen consort, she wasn't the one expected to speak. And yet, when she rose, even the shuffling of feet and quiet whispers ceased. The room stilled. The air thickened. Every pair of eyes turned to her. She carried herself with the gravity of a woman who had borne a secret too heavy for too long. "The king's final wish cannot remain hidden," she declared, her voice steady though her hands trembled at her side. The words echoed across the chamber, each syllable laden with both duty and sorrow. It wasn't just a statement, it was a verdict. Her decision to unveil the truth shattered the walls of secrecy that the monarchy thrives upon. And in that moment, Anne's loyalty shifted from the institution to something far deeper, the voice of her brother's last desire. For William, the shock was unbearable. He had expected to hear updates about treatment, perhaps guidance on preparations for the inevitable, but not this. His father's words, relayed through Anne, struck him like a tidal wave. The finality, the unspoken pain, the immense weight of what was expected of him all collided at once. His eyes filled with tears, his body trembled, and when he tried to steady himself, emotion overtook him. William broke down, unable to mask the torment in front of those who had looked to him as the calm center of the storm. The sight of the future king collapsing into grief sent shockwaves through every corner of the palace. This wasn't the composed prince the public knew. This was a man, torn open by the reality of his father's last request. The courtiers exchanged nervous glances. Some stood frozen, others whispered prayers under their breath, while a few scribbled frantic notes, already calculating the fallout. Nobody had seen this twist coming. The monarchy, which thrives on control, secrecy, and careful messaging, had just been thrown off balance by a revelation too raw to contain. A lifetime of protocol could not shield them from the force of those words. Meanwhile, just beyond the palace gates, the media frenzy was already building. Journalists, reporters, and photographers stood restless, their instincts telling them something monumental had just occurred inside. Though no official word had yet reached the public, the tension in the air was unmistakable. Whispers began to circulate something historic had been said, something that would soon redefine the royal narrative. The world waited, breath held, for confirmation. Anne, however, stood unmoved by the whispers or the consequences. She had carried this burden alone, and in fulfilling her brother's wish, she knew she had unleashed a storm. Yet there was no turning back now. Her role was sealed, not as a bystander, but as the keeper and bearer of the king's truth. But what exactly was this final wish? And why did it hit William so personally? To understand, we must go back into the king's private struggles and the family conflicts that built up to this moment. Behind the gilded doors, King Charles had been fighting more than illness, he had been battling himself. Torn between tradition, legacy, and love, the monarch carried a burden too heavy for even his closest aides to bear. To the world, he was a figure of composure, the face of continuity in uncertain times. But inside the private chambers of Windsor, when the world quieted and the echoes of duty no longer drowned his thoughts, the king's struggle was far more profound. His body weakened under the strain of illness, but it was his heart and his conscience that bore the greatest weight. For years, whispers had traveled through the palace corridors about the king's declining health. Subtle changes, discreetly hidden from public view, revealed themselves to those who knew where to look. Sleep sleepless nights, sudden moments of fatigue, the quiet withdrawal from certain public duties all became signs that his reign was not the picture of stability that the palace projected. What unsettled those closest to him most, however, was not the visible frailty, but the depth of his emotional torment. Charles wrestled constantly with the question of legacy. Would he be remembered as a transitional monarch, a bridge between two eras, or as someone who shaped the monarchy's survival in its darkest hour? Increasingly, he withdrew into isolation. At Windsor, where the night air hung heavy over ancient stone, he would spend long hours alone, staring into the shadows, as if seeking answers only history could provide. Courtiers spoke in hushed tones of his nightly reflections, moments when even the most loyal servants dared not interrupt. In those solitary hours, he was not king, not ruler, but a man plagued by regret and fear. These were the moments when the mask slipped, and his closest confidantes realized how much of himself he had sacrificed for duty. Yet there was one person who could pierce the silence: Anne. His sister, his steadfast companion through decades of royal storms, was the only one he trusted to hear the unfiltered truth. When others were kept at a distance, she was called to his side. In whispered conversations that stretched long into the night, Charles laid bare his doubts, his fears, and his hidden desires. He spoke of the crushing balance between the family he loved and the monarchy he was sworn to protect. He confessed the anguish of choices that had left scars on those dearest to him, and he wondered if there was still time to set things right. Anne listened. She did not counsel with the cold detachment of an advisor, but with the loyalty of a sister who understood that her brother's soul was caught between two worlds, the man who yearned for peace and the monarch bound to sacrifice. In these conversations, he revealed what he dared not say to anyone else. Sometimes it came in fragments, an unfinished sentence, a quiet sigh, or a gaze that lingered too long. But sometimes, when the weight was too heavy, he put his thoughts to paper. In quiet notes, letters tucked away, he captured his final intentions, words that carried the power to upend everything the monarchy stood for. Those letters, though simple in form, were devastating in meaning. Each line written in his hand became a message not for the public, not for the government, not even for Camilla or William, but for Anne alone. He chose her, not because she was heir, not because she held any constitutional power, but because she would carry his truth without distortion. She was the sole keeper of his final words, bound by a loyalty that transcended titles and roles. And while the world speculated about Charles's health, his legacy, and the future of the crown, Anne already knew that the king's story was hurtling toward a reckoning no one could prevent. And it was in one of these intimate moments, with only Anne listening, that Charles uttered the wish that would divide his family and redefine the monarchy's future. Why Anne? Why was she chosen above all others to guard the king's most explosive secret? The answer lies in a lifelong bond, built on loyalty, silence, and a shared duty that others could never match. From childhood, Anne and Charles shared a closeness that stood apart from the rest of the royal household. While others drifted into rivalries, ambitions, or the pursuit of personal freedom, Anne remained steadfast, protective, and unwavering in her devotion to her brother. She was not dazzled by titles, nor swayed by the trappings of power. For Charles, this made her unique. He knew that whatever he confided in her would never be weaponized, never betrayed, and never diluted by palace politics. Throughout their lives, this quiet alliance became a shield against the pressures of the institution. When royal politics grew toxic, when advisors whispered conflicting strategies, when Camilla pressed her influence, and when even William's expectations bore heavily upon him, Charles often turned instead to Anne. She was not a competitor, not someone clawing for position, but a sister whose loyalty was anchored in family rather than crown. In her, he found what he could not find in anyone else: silence that was not judgment, and presence that did not demand. Their bond became a refuge from the suffocating world of monarchy. It was during these private moments that Charles entrusted her with what would become his most fateful burden. In his weakening state, uncertain how much time remained, he placed into her care a sealed note of his words, unfiltered and final. This letter, folded neatly and marked only for her, was never shown to Camilla, never whispered to William, and never hinted at to his advisors. Only Anne held it, tucked away from the eyes of even the most intrusive palace staff. She carried it like a piece of fire hidden in her chest, knowing that its contents could ignite a blaze that would consume them all. The torment of this responsibility gnawed at her. To walk through corridors filled with speculation, to sit in rooms where decisions were made without knowledge of the truth, to hear William speak of preparing for the crown while knowing there was something he did not yet see. This was Anne's silent agony. She knew the words inside that letter had the power to devastate, and she also knew that time was running out before they would need to be revealed. Every day she kept the secret was another day of unbearable weight pressing upon her conscience. What makes this burden even more haunting is that Anne herself did not want to be the messenger. She was not drawn to the role of arbiter between family members or executor of her brother's will. Yet Charles had left her with no choice. His command was clear, spoken with the solemnity of a man staring down mortality. "Do not let my final wish be buried. When the time comes, you must be the one to speak it." Those words bound her. They gave her no escape, no room to shrink away. She could not betray her brother's last instruction. And so, when the moment came, she broke her silence. Not out of desire, not out of ambition, but because her brother had demanded it of her. His voice echoed in her memory, urging her forward, even as the fallout threatened to destroy everything around her. For Anne, it was never about her choice. It was about her duty to him. But what did the king ask for that was so devastating? The answer strikes at the very core of the monarchy's survival and William's deepest fears. When Anne's voice trembled but did not falter, the truth came crashing down. The king's final wish wasn't about titles or property. It was about the crown itself. For a moment, there was silence, a suffocating stillness, as those words hung heavy in the air. No one dared move. No one dared breathe. And then, as the meaning settled in, the weight of the revelation struck with full force. Charles's last request was not for comfort, not for reconciliation, but for a decision that would upend the monarchy in its entirety. The king, in his dying words, had made it clear. He did not want Camilla to be remembered as queen. This was not a half-thought murmur spoken in weakness, but a conviction etched into his heart in the final months of his life. For all the years of controversy, for all the battles fought to secure her place beside him, he had undone it with one sentence. Camilla was to be erased from the crown's legacy. It was not a slight, not a passing thought, but a deliberate demand that Anne now carried into the world. In those words, Charles severed the chain of tradition that had been carefully spun around his wife and pointed instead toward a future he believed the monarchy required. That future was William and Catherine. The king's final wish was that the monarchy should pass directly to them, with full honors and without delay. Not when time naturally claimed him, not after a prolonged struggle for control, but immediately. He sought what he called a quiet abdication, a passage written in his own hand, sealing his intent. The idea was as shocking as it was absolutely an unbroken transfer of power, tearing away Camilla's crown in the process. What Anne revealed was not just a father's faith in his son, but also a ruthless correction of a path he no longer believed in. The effect on William was devastating. Already crumbling under the immense strain of his father's decline, the demand placed upon him was almost unbearable. Tears fell as the weight of responsibility consumed him. He was not just being asked to grieve, he was being commanded to rise, to take on the role for which he had been prepared all his life, but in the most brutal way imaginable. The burden pressed down harder, because in fulfilling his father's wish, he would betray his stepmother. He would strip her not only of power but of dignity, forcing her into the shadows of history. William's breakdown was not simply grief for a father he was losing, it was grief for the storm he knew he was about to unleash. The room could not contain its reaction. Gasps rose from corners of the chamber, some stunned, others outraged. Camilla's loyalists, those who had built their careers and reputations on her acceptance as queen, looked as though the ground had been ripped from beneath them. For years, they had fought to legitimize her place at Charles's side. And now, in a single revelation, all of it threatened to collapse. Their voices whispered in disbelief, some muttering of conspiracy, others of betrayal. But Anne's steady tone and the sealed letter she referenced left no doubt. This was not speculation, this was Charles's will. At that moment, the room split into factions. One group, those who had long believed William and Catherine to be the rightful bearers of the crown's full weight, stood silently in support, their eyes fixed on him as if willing him to rise. The other group, Camilla's defenders, bristled with fury. unwilling to accept that the years of effort to make her queen could be wiped away with a single sentence. What began as a revelation became a battlefield of loyalties. Sibling against spouse, duty against desire, past against future. And yet, through the chaos, the one undeniable truth was that Charles had spoken his last command. Anne had merely delivered it. Whether anyone liked it or not, the king's final wish was now alive, and it could not be buried again. The question was no longer whether the monarchy would change, but whether those within it could survive the cost of that change. And while William's grief consumed him, Camilla's fury began to burn. For the queen, this was not only betrayal, it was erasure. The revelation was not just shocking, it was humiliating. Camilla, the crowned queen consort, stripped in spirit by her own husband's words, stood frozen before unleashing her anger. For years she had fought, endured whispers, endured ridicule, and finally secured her place beside Charles as queen. And now, with one final command, he had undone it all. The woman who had walked through fire for her crown was suddenly thrust back into the shadows, reduced to a figure his legacy wished to erase. Her silence at first was chilling, her face hardening as disbelief spread through her, before it cracked open into outrage. "This cannot be true," she spat, her voice sharp enough to cut through the stunned chamber. She refused to accept it, and refused to believe that Charles would betray her in such a manner. She accused Anne of twisting the truth, of bending the king's words to suit her own loyalties. Her fury burned not only at the revelation itself, but at the source of the sister-in-law who had dared to speak aloud what Charles had entrusted. For Camilla, this was a personal assassination, carried out by someone who had always kept her at arm's length. Anne, however, did not waver. Calm but unyielding, she met Camilla's fury with the unshakable strength of conviction. "I would never betray my brother's trust," she declared, her words delivered with a finality that allowed no argument. The tension between them electrified the room. It was not simply a clash of women. It was a battle between truth and denial, duty and pride. Camilla's anger surged, but Anne's quiet determination proved unbreakable. What was spoken could not be unsaid, and the note in Anne's possession stood as proof no outrage could erase. Around them, aides whispered in urgent tones, already calculating the disaster that could unfold if this revelation ever left the palace walls. The monarchy survived on control, and this was chaos. A secret so explosive, if it slipped into public view, could ignite a scandal that would rip through Britain and beyond. The hushed warnings swirled through the chamber like smoke. If this got out, the monarchy would face its gravest crisis in decades. Yet, silence was no longer an option, because once truth is spoken, it cannot be contained. In the middle of it all stood William, torn apart by the storm raging before him. To honor his father was to honor the truth Anne carried. To bow to Camilla's fury was to keep the peace, but at the cost of betraying Charles's dying wish. His heart was split, his body trembling under the weight of two impossible loyalties. He looked to Anne and saw duty. He looked at Camilla and saw rage. And all the while, he could feel the burden of the crown pressing heavier than ever before. And then there was Catherine. Silent, yet every movement, every glance, revealed her turmoil. She was not the one speaking, not the one clashing in fury, but her presence was undeniable. She watched her husband fall apart under the pressure, her sister-in-law defy a queen, and the monarchy teeter on collapse. Her eyes filled with emotion, the kind that bore both sorrow and steel. She knew what was at stake, even if she could not yet speak it aloud. But the tension didn't end there. In fact, Anne's revelation ignited a chain reaction, one that would spill beyond palace walls and shake the nation itself. It was supposed to remain hidden, but secrets that explosive never stay buried for long, and soon the king's final wish was no longer just palace gossip. It became a national headline. What had begun as a private revelation between Anne, William, and the inner circle now thundered across Britain with unstoppable force. Somewhere within those gilded halls, silence cracked, and a mysterious leak spilled into the hands of the press. The story spread like wildfire, unstoppable, igniting shock and disbelief in every corner of the nation. The monarchy, long masterful in its control of narrative, was suddenly stripped bare before the eyes of millions. By dawn, the next morning, the tabloids had seized their prey. Front pages screamed of betrayal, of a queen erased, of a king's dying words that dismantled the very order of succession. Charles's final wish, "William must reign now," blazed across headlines in bold, merciless ink. Television screens replayed the whispers, commentators dissected every syllable of the leak, and radio hosts fanned the flames with speculation. What had been confined to the palace was now the possession of an entire nation, and the people were relentless in their hunger for more. The public's reaction was immediate and fierce. Across the country, an outpouring of sympathy surged for William. He was seen not only as a grieving son, but as a man thrust into destiny against his will. The sight of his tears, whispered through insider accounts, stirred a deep compassion among the people. And with that sympathy came fury. Fury directed at Camilla. She became the lightning rod of blame, the woman who had stood beside the king, but now was cast as the obstacle to his final desire. Crowds gathered outside royal residences, some holding placards that read, "Honor his wish," others chanting William's name, as if he were already their king. Yet, the storm was not confined to the public alone. Political pressure began to mount with ferocity. Senior officials demanded clarity, warning that uncertainty at the heart of the monarchy endangered national stability. Members of parliament spoke openly in chambers, urging the crown to issue a definitive statement before chaos consumed confidence in the institution itself. What was once an intimate family matter had now become a constitutional crisis, and every delay only deepened the fracture. Inside the palace, aides scrambled in panic. Teams of advisors drafted and redrafted responses, desperate to quell the firestorm. But every attempt to contain it failed. For each carefully worded denial, another leak slipped through. For every effort to restore dignity, another headline tore it apart. The machinery of secrecy, once the monarchy's greatest shield, was faltering. And in that collapse, the king's final wish stood unmovable, undeniable, and devastating. The monarchy had reached a point of no return. It was not just a question of succession anymore, it was a test of survival. The people demanded answers. The government demanded resolution. And at the center of it all stood William. The man pulled between loyalty to his father's dying command and the fury of a stepmother determined not to be erased. The crown itself seemed to hang in the balance, caught between the old guard and a future being forced into existence. And as the outside world raged, inside the palace, William faced the most agonizing choice of his life, whether to fulfill his father's wish or protect what little peace remained. For William, the king's final wish was both an honor and a curse. The weight of duty pressed on his shoulders until he could no longer stand tall. He broke down, the nation watching every tremor. To the outside world, he remained the stoic heir, carrying himself with dignity, as reporters shouted questions and the public demanded answers. But behind closed doors, William was unraveling. He was not only a son grieving the imminent loss of his father, but a man torn apart by the unbearable demand to fulfill a wish that would fracture his family forever. In his private chambers, grief consumed him in ways he had never allowed the world to see. He wept openly, torn between love for his father and the reality that honoring his words would mean standing against Camilla, the woman who had been at Charles's side through decades of controversy. His anguish grew heavier by the hour, intensified by the relentless headlines and the political voices calling for clarity. And so, he turned to the one person who understood the burden as intimately as he did Anne. Their conversations became tearful confrontations, William pleading for guidance, Anne urging him to remember that duty was not about ease, but about sacrifice. In those exchanges, Anne's strength became his crutch, though even she could not erase the torment that plagued him. Through it all, Catherine remained his quiet anchor. She did not raise her voice or interfere in the clashes around him, but her vow of loyalty never wavered. In moments when William's grief threatened to crush him, Catherine's presence reminded him that he was not alone. She carried the weight with him in silence, her eyes conveying the promise that, whatever storm came, she would stand beside him. Yet her silent strength did little to shield him from the ghosts that haunted him. For deep within, William's greatest fear was not only failing his father, it was repeating the tragedy of his mother, Diana. He saw the same storm clouds gathering, a monarchy torn apart, a family divided, and a woman, this time Camilla, at the center of a national firestorm. Memories of his mother's suffering clawed at him, and he feared that history was preparing to repeat itself in a crueler, more merciless form. This fear gnawed at him, until it became unbearable, filling his nights with restless shadows and his days with unrelenting dread. And then came the breaking point. In what was meant to be a private meeting with senior advisors, William collapsed emotionally, the tears he had tried so desperately to contain spilling without restraint. His voice cracked, his hands trembled, and the weight of expectation crushed him before those who had once looked to him as unshakable. But nothing inside the palace remained private for long. Within hours, word of his collapse slipped into the press. The world was shown not the unbreakable prince, but a man drowning in grief, a future king stripped of armor, his humanity laid bare for all to see. The images painted by these leaks shocked the nation. To some, it was heartbreaking, a son lost in sorrow, a man burdened by destiny. To others, it was inspiring. For in his pain, they saw authenticity, a leader not afraid to feel, a future king who embodied both strength and vulnerability. William's suffering, though tragic, bound the nation to him in ways no speech could have achieved. The people saw not just their heir, but their destiny. And just when William thought he could not take more, another twist emerged. One last letter from the king himself. Hidden in the king's private desk was a letter addressed only to William. When it surfaced, the entire palace froze because, in its words, lay the ultimate confirmation of his father's dying wish. For days, whispers had circled that Charles had left behind something more than just words spoken to Anne. Some doubted it, some dismissed it as rumor. But when Anne appeared before William holding a single envelope sealed with their father's crest, the truth could no longer be denied. The air turned heavy, and for William, time seemed to stop. Anne placed the letter directly into her nephew's trembling hands. She had carried the weight of her brother's command in her heart, but now the burden was being passed on to the one who could no longer escape it. William stared at the envelope as though it were fire, his hesitation showing the torment inside him. Breaking the seal meant confronting his destiny. But to leave it unopened would be to dishonor the man whose dying words still haunted every corner of the palace. At last, with unsteady fingers, he tore it open. The moment his eyes landed on the handwriting, there was no doubt. The pen strokes were his father's, each line bearing the familiarity of years of correspondence. It was unmistakable, undeniable, and devastating. William's throat tightened as he began to read. His father's words were not vague musings, nor were they softened with hesitation. They were direct, sharp, and absolute. Step forward now, before it's too late. With those few words, Charles had removed all possibility of delay, all excuses, all hiding from the truth. His wish was not simply for William to inherit the crown, it was for him to take it now, without hesitation. As William read on, the words grew heavier. The crown cannot survive being divided. It was both a warning and a prophecy. His father knew that the fractures inside the palace, the competing loyalties, and the looming conflict with Camilla's supporters would destroy the monarchy if left unresolved. To Charles, the only way to preserve the institution was through decisive action, and he placed that duty squarely on his son's shoulders. For William, every sentence was a dagger cutting through his grief, stripping him of comfort and replacing it with unbearable responsibility. Tears welled in his eyes again, not just from sorrow, but from a strange new resolve that began to take root. The words were crushing, yet they carried with them a clarity he had not felt before. For the first time, the confusion of loyalty versus duty was replaced by certainty. His father had chosen him, not Camilla, not compromise, but him. And though the choice would shatter relationships and ignite conflict, William began to feel the truth settling inside him. The path was laid out. His father's final command was no longer just a wish. It was now his obligation. The monarchy itself now teetered on the edge of transformation. What had once been whispers and speculation was now written in the king's own hand, proof that could not be dismissed, evidence that no one could refute. The palace staff who learned of the letter whispered of history in motion, of a turning point that would forever change the crown. The time for secrecy was over, and the time for reckoning had arrived. And so, the stage was set not for quiet succession, but for a royal reckoning that would change the family, the palace, and the crown forever. This was no longer about a family feud. It was about the survival of the monarchy itself. And, with the king's final wish laid bare, William, Anne, and Camilla found themselves locked in a battle that would decide the crown's future. Every word Charles had left behind, Every instruction now revealed had shifted the monarchy from tradition into uncharted waters. For William, stepping forward was no longer a choice. It was the moment his father had prepared him for, even if the cost was more than he could bear. The burden weighed on his shoulders like iron, but within it lay the blessing of legitimacy, a father's final declaration that he was the rightful heir to carry the monarchy into the future. Anne stood beside him, unshakable and resolute. She had been the voice of the king's will when others faltered, the steady hand that refused to let truth be buried under politics or emotion. Through every clash and every tear, she had protected her brother's words, and now she became William's fiercest ally. Her presence was more than symbolic. It was a shield. With Anne at his side, William carried not only the crown's weight, but the echo of his father's final command. Together, they formed a unity that gave strength to the path ahead, even as shadows of resistance loomed large. Camilla, however, was not prepared to vanish quietly. Defiance burned within her, fiercer than ever. For decades, she had endured criticism, exile from public favor, and relentless attacks on her character, only to fight her way to the throne. To be erased now, not by public opinion, but by the very man whose reign had secured her place, was a humiliation she refused to accept. She declared, in private and in fury, that she would not surrender, that she would not be cast aside as if she were a mistake to be forgotten. Her supporters rallied around her, clinging to the belief that her crown could not be stolen by a dying wish and a letter hidden in a desk. In her defiance, the monarchy fractured further, split between the will of the king and the fury of his widow. Amid this storm stood Catherine, silent but luminous, the one constant who embodied dignity in chaos. She did not need to speak loudly to be heard. Her quiet grace, her steady support of William, and her image as a mother, a wife, and a future queen made her the symbol of hope for millions. In Catherine, the public saw continuity, compassion, and the possibility of a monarchy that could endure. She was the thread holding William together when everything else threatened to tear him apart. And so the monarchy itself stood divided, a house split but stumbling toward an inevitable decision. The king's final words had set into motion a reckoning that no one could halt. It was no longer about Camilla's pride or William's pain. It was about whether the crown could survive intact, or whether it would collapse under the weight of betrayal and grief. The path forward was treacherous, but one truth remained undeniable. The monarchy could only endure if William found the strength to fulfill the last wish his father had entrusted to Anne. And so, as history rewrites itself before our eyes, one thing is certain: King Charles's final wish did not end with his words. It began with William's tears. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.